about birds and plants. It's a thing I really enjoy. So let's start out with sharing my screen here. So everybody, oh, you guys seeing? There we
I see
go.
that.
You see our lovely little friend, the California scrub jay, formerly the
I sure
Western
do.
scrub jay. So this is birds and plants are inextricably linked. I've over the years I've picked up that when I'm out birding, if I want to see a certain thing, I can go and count on that they will be in a certain place because of the plant communities that are there. You guys have probably all seen Doug Tallamy's talk to the California Native Plant Society from a few years back, and he talks a lot about how uh, plants provide food for, especially for young birds, through the caterpillars that they feed, and that most birds couldn't reproduce without the caterpillars that are fed by the plants we have in our yards, well, and everywhere pretty much. But the thing with birding, the biggest part is finding birds, and so you go out and you look for certain places. So if I want to see things like California scrub jays, white-breasted nuthatches, western bluebirds, I look for oak woodlands a lot of times. So this is an example and then so this guy is the California scrub jay. It's carrying an acorn, and then another fine example here is a lovely acorn woodpecker. So another bird that you'll find commonly around those same areas. Um, they both use acorns in a different way. So acorn woodpeckers, they both store them, but very differently. So acorn woodpeckers have granary trees where they stuff the acorns into holes that they've made in the wood. You can see this one's very old. The holes are very quite deep, and the acorns are probably fall out of these quite a bit. They stuff them real far in there now. And so that doesn't help the oak too much because mostly those acorns are not available for to be grown. But the interesting thing about oaks and jays is that jays are very, very good at planting oaks. If you've maintained garden beds at your home, you probably know this. You get weird oak volunteers popping up in your vegetable garden. Likely that's the work of a jay. So, and the other great thing about jays and oaks is that they disperse the acorns long distances, so the acorns can get a lot farther from the parent tree. And so, jays are actually responsible. The stat that I've heard is that um, there are places where there are jays but no oaks, but there are not really any places in the world where there are oaks without jays. So, pretty cool thing about that. And then jays also plant acorns or tend to cache acorns in the soil just at the perfect level for them to germinate. But that's likely a coevolutionary thing because the oak trees that germinated when they were planted by jays survived better and had then grew up to be big trees and have more pass on their genes through spreading their acorns around more widely. So pretty cool. There's another example. I asked some friends for some pictures of birds and native plants, and I got about 5 or 6 pictures of jays carrying big old acorns because it is a very common thing you see when you're out and about. Um, one of my other favorite relationships with birds is pretty much any fruiting bush, but particularly mistletoe and the phainopepla. This is a male phainopepla. This shiny iridescent black plumage and a nice little raggedy crest. This one is feeding on some hollyleaf cherry, but phainopeplas are really well known for their relationship with mistletoe. So mistletoe, if you want to find phainopeplas, like when I go out on Christmas bird counts, if I need a phainopepla for the day and I haven't seen one yet, I look for trees that are just laden with mistletoe, and odds are that's where I'm going to find one for my list. They also have an interesting life cycle in that in the northern part of their range where we are, they come up here in the summer kind of summer through fall and winter, and then in the early spring they fly south to the desert. They migrate down to the desert and nest there while feeding on the mistletoe, the desert mistletoe. And then once they're done breeding down there, they fly back north to our area and breed again in the kind of the oak woodlands and in the low Sierra. So it's a really interesting, not most birds don't breed at either end of their range, and they can do this because they heavily feed on mistletoe berries. So pretty cool. But yeah, if I want to find a phainopepla on a Christmas bird count, that's what I go looking for, berry producing trees, and particularly mistletoe. So let's see some of the other ones. If you want to find a hummingbird, you just look for things like California fuchsia or sage, especially. And there's a really close relationship between, in our area, especially if you want to find the Costa's hummingbird, that one you'll look for it in black sage. And black sage is relatively range limited around here, but you can go to spots year after year where there are black sage tree bushes, and you'll find Costa's hummingbirds around. So this one here is a young male Anna's hummingbird, and see the fuchsia color flowers on the face, or the fuchsia color feathers on the face. They're coming in, molting in, and this is a California fuchsia. But they also, actually, there we go. There's another slightly different California fuchsia with an Allen or a Rufus hummingbird. So this is a Rufus hummingbird here. But yeah, they like red flowers. They like tubular shaped flowers. So sages, mints, the epilobium. So a lot of different members of those genera. Where the hummingbirds tend to get a lot of food. There's some other birds that I really think of as synonymous with the plants. So when I'm on a Christmas count, another bird that I'll be looking for, if I haven't found one for the day, is a hermit thrush. And hermit thrush is really, really like toyon. So that is a hermit thrush there with their kind of red wings and red primary feathers, reddish, rusty red. And then if I find I need a hermit thrush, I look for the place where I have toyon in my area, and almost guaranteed I will find a hermit thrush in it. Usually more than one. Sometimes you'll go to like where there'll be a hillside of toyon. You'll have not seen a hermit thrush all day, and you'll kind of just play one call just to see if you can get one to respond, and the whole hillside will chirp full of hermit thrush. There'll be like 5 or 6 hermit thrushes all come out to take a look and see what's there, who's there. It's a lot of fun, and one of those relationships that you can really count on when you're out there in the field. Let's see some of the other ones I love. Oh, this is a cool. Where's my picture? There we go. So this is a picture a friend sent me of a Lawrence's goldfinch. In the springtime, these guys, they're one of the names. There's a big movement to rename a lot of the birds that have eponymous names, so honorifics like Lawrence, named after a guy named Lawrence. And one of the names proposed for the Lawrence's goldfinch is the wandering goldfinch, because they tend to be very nomadic. They don't always nest in the same places from year to year. They'll kind of show up in just random spots, predictable but random. They'll move around in groups. But if you're looking for Lawrence's goldfinch in the foothills, and you want to, and you haven't found one yet, look for patches of this plant here. This is fiddleneck or Amsynchia. I imagine a lot of you recognize this and see it quite a bit. But yeah, they really love fiddleneck. It is a really common plant that they search out. So, sorry, my dogs are looking at me very expectantly. All right. So some of the other plants that this is a bird called a bush tit. They usually eat a lot of insects, but they will go after berries. This is I think this is a huckleberry over on the coast. A friend of mine sent me this from Mendocino County. So you can see it's foraging in the feather the flowers of this plant. So it's probably looking for insects, but we'll also drink some nectar and eat any, we'll take a bite out of some fruit if it can get it. All right. Here's a nice picture of a young Western bluebird. This one looks like, I believe that's a elderberry. Elderberries are really important berry producing plant for birds. There's really common it's like one of the really common things fruiting really early in the fall. So things like in August when like the tanagers and the cedar waxwings are just returning, and the young robins are out. They'll eat a lot of elderberry. Later in the year, this is a American robin here. It's going for toyon. So toyon's really important because later in the season, it's one of the few things that has berries left at the end of the year. So that's one that a lot of the birds, especially the thrushes, the hermit thrushes, and the robins will eat. So, yeah. Let's see. Oh, here's one with a non-native berry. This is an orange crown, or actually a Tennessee warbler, going for a blackberry. That unfortunately is the non-native Himalayan blackberry, but the native blackberries and the native raspberries are well loved by birds. And there's our friend, the cedar waxwing. So these guys, when they first come back from the mountains, they really like the elderberries, but then they kind of take advantage of whatever else is around. A lot of the birds help move around these plants too. So like a lot of these berry producing plants are spread by birds. They swallow the fruits and then go out and defecate the seeds somewhere far away from the adult plant, so they can spread them around. There's a house finch with some elderberry. And that's a wren-tit, probably a bird that most people here haven't seen. Very secretive bird it's usually found in kind of chaparral or coastal sage habitat, and occasionally some riparian. This is probably down in riparian along a creek or something like that, because that's where elderberry grows usually. One of the other things, like when I'm another thing that when I'm birding in the fall, I tend to look for oaks, just because that's where a lot of the birds are hanging out. Not just for the acorns, obviously the larger birds, but a lot of small birds depend on oaks because they actually are a huge source of caterpillars. As I mentioned before, Doug Tallamy talks about them being like the real superstar of biodiversity. Something like the white oak, in our case the valley oak, has something like 400 species of moth and butterfly that their caterpillars feed on oak. And especially the oak moth caterpillar is really a big food source in the early fall. So if I'm looking for rare warblers, a lot of times, in fact, I think I have one of my photos of a Blackburnian warbler that I took over in Yolo County. And that bird was very strictly hanging out in a particular couple of valley oaks, mainly because every time you could shake the branches, if you go up to one of these oaks in the fall and like shake a branch, like these white moths will kind of just scatter. Those are the oak moths, and then their caterpillars are just densely nutrient packed food for birds. So, and I talked about the oaks and jays dispersing their acorns. One of the cool things, there's actually a paper. The one I found was about Eurasian jay and a particular oat species that they're associated with, but they are responsible for moving the oaks up slope. So most, obviously a heavy acorn is not going to make it on its own. They would obviously roll downhill if they just hit the ground and rolled. But the jays can actually take acorns and move oaks upslope. And that's really important, especially we talk about climate change and how, the biomes are shifting and things like that. Well, a lot of times plants would move upslope to escape, warmer temperatures. And one of the ways that oaks can do that is because jays move their acorns. So, ooh, I see some questions. Good. I like questions. Those are helpful. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, toyon berries are very well, and they're also really important because, like I said, they're one of the last. They're one of the last berries that are on trees. Most of a lot of times, everything else has been eaten, and they ripen really late in the season. So in the coldest part of winter, when birds kind of need the fats the most, toyon are just becoming ripe. They call them Christmas berry, is one of the other common names for toyon. So yeah, if you do have questions, I don't worry about holding them until the end. If you have questions, feel free to throw them out. I'll work them in as I go. In fact, it's really helpful to kind of have questions for, so I'm not just up here rambling. Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate it. I think I have to say I answered live. There we go. All right. Let's see. Yeah, so here's another example of a fruit-eating bird. So this is a black-headed grosbeak. And again, I think this is another coastal huckleberry type thing. So a lot of those fruits get eaten by birds. Here's another example of this is a cedar waxwing. You can see actually the feature that it's named for, which is these little red tips on the secondaries of the wing there. Those are little waxy protrusions that come out of the feather shaft. And they actually, I've actually been able to like find them and touch them, and they are really waxy. You can they break like, they remind me of like crayon wax, like when you scrape crayon off. It's really, really interesting. Let's see, where's the other? Oh, here's another one. This is a Townsend's warbler. So this is one of the warbler species. They'll occasionally eat fruit. So this is not a real common thing, but they usually feed on a lot of insects, and they're one of the ones that you can often find in oaks in the fall, coming through. This is a picture from my friend Shannon Scalos. But yeah. And then here's another, this is an adult Western bluebird male, feeding on holly leaf cherry again. So a lot of the chaparral plants in the foothills are berry producing and feed birds that way and help move their seeds around. Victoria said, "What's the evolutionary purpose of the wax protrusions on waxwings?" I actually don't know that we know the answer to that. I haven't heard if the females select for it in any way. Most things that are like colorful or adornments like that are usually because female sex selection. They choose mates based on like red-winged blackbirds, the male with the biggest red epaulets, gets the girl. In fact, they've actually found that they've ruined various breeding studies because they put color bands on the males on their legs to kind of tell which male was which. And they found that males that had bright bands, colored bands, would win more territories and have more females in their territories than other males because of the bands that they put on them. So yeah, they kind of messed that one up and had to go back to the drawing board on like, how do we do this without influencing how they choose their mates? So, ooh, somebody asked, what birds like native grapes? A lot of them. So pretty much all the berry eaters that I've talked about, black-headed grosbeaks, western bluebirds, robins. When I go to the American River Parkway, if I want to look for robins and tanagers, those are a lot of times found in native grape. Yeah. So. And then what are some good caterpillar host plants for yards to attract the moths and butterflies? Yeah, depending on what I mean, obviously the superstar is oaks. If you have an oak tree, that's the best thing. That's because it hosts the most kind of species. But I love, if you guys haven't used it, I imagine most of you have, is calscape.org. I know they're planning on a big update of it. But you can actually look in your zip code and and asked for specifically host plants that host caterpillars. Um, Lupins have a lot of caterpillars. That's one of the species I know is really good for that. Let's see, lupins, willows are really good. Pretty much most species of native plant host some species of caterpillar. That's the thing, is that there are pretty wide variety of things, but the ones that host the most are yeah, things like oaks, willows are the highest, and then and some of the willows grow in nice little as bushes. You can kind of grow them more that way. I'm trying to think what other ones I found a lot of them on. Yeah, choke cherries. So yeah, unfortunately in the valley there's not many species of cherry. So but this again, this is holly leaf cherry right here. This is one species that is kind of close by here. Um I'm trying to think of other ones, but oaks are the superstar. If you have an oak tree, you're going to have um, plenty of caterpillars around. Oh, I think Baccharis, like coyote brush, and mule fat. I think actually has a few more than. But California grape has caterpillars, sycamores, elderberries. They all host some number of them. Coffee berry hosts caterpillars. Yeah, there's kind of a wide variety there. Oh, why is the Central Valley the stopover for so many migrating birds? Um, Most of the ones that are the biggest travelers that come through our area are things like ducks and shorebirds, and that's because we traditionally, hundreds of years ago, before Europeans came here and started managing all the rivers and drying up all the wetlands, we had a lot of waterfowl habitat and and marshy areas, and so um, we kind of became a stop on the flyway between the wintering areas down in Mexico and Southern and Central America, and the breeding stopover. When actually a lot of the final destination for a lot of northern Alaska and Arctic migrating shorebirds is the Central Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area. So like the San Francisco Bay Area is like the biggest stopping point, the wintering grounds for like Western sandpiper. The Central Valley, of course, greater white-fronted goose, cackling goose, Aleutian cackling goose. So a lot of the birds came here because of the wetlands that were traditionally around before we drained them. So luckily this year there is a lot of water in the reservoirs, so they're probably going to be flooding a lot of rice fields, which means a lot of habitat for ducks and geese and for shorebirds as well. And then previous to European expansion and the cutting of riparian forest, we had a lot more riparian forest, which also was rich in a lot of these berry producing things like grape. So a lot of these birds had abundant food and abundant cover. So let's see, what haven't I covered here? Yeah, I was looking it up on the side here. Coffeeberry has 10 confirmed butterflies and moths hosted, and up to 23 are likely. So, sorry, dogs wanted back in. Oh, yeah, yellow-billed magpie. So my actually the picture that I offered was yellow-billed magpie. And magpies are interesting, and they like open spaces, but near big trees. So trees like sycamore, valley oak, especially, those are kind of the two biggest one. The western sycamore and valley oaks they like those really big, large trees to put their nests in. If you've seen them, they look like a ball. So the nest is a domed roof. It's one of the few nest building species that builds like a full, like roofed nest. It's really cool. But they specifically like places where there are a lot of large trees next to open grassy areas. So you see that like Ansel Hoffman Park, Hagen Park, right by the place I lead walks is Soilborn Farms over in Rancho Cordova. And right next door, there's Hagen Park, where there's lots of big, tall sycamores. And the sycamores are just full of yellow-billed magpie nests. And you'll often see the magpies out feeding on the lawn, looking for worms and other things to eat. They're omnivores. So they kind of will go after whatever's around. They eat a lot of caterpillars. They eat a lot of fruit. They eat pretty much whatever they can get a hold of. They're very adaptable and smart birds. So, yeah. I'm trying to think what other, but yeah, that's the main relationship, is that they like really big trees for nesting, and so they can put their nests up real high and have. Oh, California buckeye. That's an interesting one, because a lot of people know that California buckeye is poisonous. But there are quite a few things that do eat it. The thing is the reason plants have poisons in general is because it's kind of an arms race with the insects that eat them. They have caterpillars that eat them, and they're trying to stop themselves from being eaten too much, so they can still have enough energy to put into their seeds, into their fruiting. And so, actually, I don't know. Let's see, California. Oh, they actually have it here on Calscape as a host plant. It says 2 confirmed. But 11 likely. So a fair number of caterpillars hosted. But the big thing with buckeye is the early profusion of blooms. So they are one of the first plants to leaf out in the spring. So they leaf out as early as February, and they start flowering, between March and April. And native pollinators do very well with buckeye. They're fine. People talk about buckeye being poisonous to bees, but that's specifically the non-native honeybee, because they don't have an evolutionary relationship with buckeye. They're from the old world, from Europe and Asia, and so they're not really. They don't have the ability to deal with the toxins in the pollen that our native bees do. So, plus our native bees tend to go more strictly for nectar, and they eat less of the pollen, whereas honeybees in particular, gather pollen as a thing to make honey from. And in order to make honey, they basically chew up the pollen and then regurgitate, and that's part of what makes honey. And so in that act, they're ingesting a lot more of the poison that is associated with California buckeye. So, oh yeah, unfortunately, Alan Kilgore mentioned, what about yellow-billed cuckoos? They are very rare. They used to be a lot more common because their habitat used to be a lot more common. So they are a riparian woodland specialist, especially cottonwood and willow woodlands. And so they mainly their nest success is associated with the proliferation of web caterpillars. So they really rely on kind of young cottonwood woodlands, because those are the trees that tend to be most susceptible to having large outbreaks of those web caterpillars. And so they really like trees that are between like 20 and 30 years old. And so, that habitat is a lot rarer now than it used to be. So, the constant disturbance of rivers by flooding events is what, kind of changed the way that cottonwoods, those woodlands would be a mix of like, old big trees, and then a big flood would come in and knock out a big area, and then 10-15 years later that would regrow, and then it would be the right age for the caterpillars, and therefore for the cuckoos. But because our rivers are so intensely managed now, that there's a lot less of that habitat available. So there are places like up in Tehama County and Butte County where the Nature Conservancy has bought land, and some of the state parks There's land that they own where they manage 4 sections of forest that are the right age and the right production of caterpillars for yellow-billed cuckoos. And I've actually seen yellow-billed cuckoos up there on tours into the kind of the back areas where you're not allowed to go. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, they are kind of going to be. I don't know that they're ever going to be, what they were. That's for sure. Just because there's not that habitat's not going to be that much more prevalent anytime in the future, probably. So they're probably going to be in pretty low numbers, even though they are gorgeous birds. Back east, they're not so heavily tied with a specific habitat like they are in the West. But the birds in the West, there's a lot less habitat in general. So you have these dry areas where that aren't suitable for them because they don't have big, the nice trees that they like, and therefore the caterpillars. And so they're kind of confined to these used to be a lot more because, we only have 5% of our riparian forests compared to the, pre 1840, before the gold rush. But yeah, unfortunately, that's a story for a lot of things. We have much less of the habitat. So of course you have much less of the birds. The biggest problem these days with a lot of things that feed on caterpillars is that they've found declining numbers of things like loggerhead shrikes and a lot of the other insectivores that feed on large insects because of advancements in insecticides. They're killing off a lot of the large insect biomass, things like the larger moths, the Jerusalem crickets, or people call them potato bugs. A lot of those larger that we can, the people that in agriculture consider pest species, those feed a lot of birds. And so it's because of the biomass decreasing, it's bad news for birds in general. So one of the things I was talking about, and I've read a lot about, is the windscreen effect. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. It's how, 20 or 30 years ago, I used to drive in the summer, and you drive a few nights and your windshield would be so covered in bugs that you wouldn't be able to drive until you washed it. And now I find I can go, weeks in the summer without having to wash my windshield because there's just not as many insects hitting it. And some of that is aerodynamics in cars is better, but a lot of it is there are just fewer insects to hit your window. Yeah, that's the same thing for purple martins. There's just fewer insects for them to feed on. And they're also habitat, they're nesting specialists. They use cavity nests. So things like, it's really interesting. Purple martins in California, back east, purple martins are almost exclusively in human areas. So where we put up gourds and other kind of nest sites for purple martins, their houses and stuff, they're because they had such a long relationship with the Native Americans of the East. And the Native Americans would, in their large settlements, would put up big martin, like gourd towers. The martins and humans really became linked in the East. And that didn't happen in the West the same way. So in the West, you still find purple martins nesting in their native substrate. So like down in the Tehachapi Mountains, I worked on a friend's project for purple martin nesting, and we found that they were nesting. It's one of the few places in the state where they're still nesting in large valley oaks that overlook the valley. So they like these big promontories where you can look. It's a huge view down to the valley, and then these giant oaks with nest holes, and there's purple martins all over those. And then, but you go up to other places up in the mountains in the Northwest, and they're nesting in large, dead trees like dead sequoias or dead Doug firs, things like that, where there's nest holes. So, but in here, of course, in Sacramento, they've adapted to using our freeway overpasses, and particularly the ones that have these weep holes where there's underneath, they can go up into the understory of the overpasses and put their nests up there. So really interesting. It's like the only place in California where where they've really picked that up as like their main nesting thing. Someone said, do you think if hedgerows were more prevalent, that would help with insect population recovery? Absolutely. Yeah. Especially, so hedgerows are huge, especially if they're not being sprayed at all. The biggest problem is even in places where you put up and have native habitat, Something happens like West Nile virus, and then the next thing you know, they're aerial spraying the whole area, hoping to kill mosquitoes, but unfortunately they're killing all the insects, which, especially in the summertime when mosquitoes are a problem, that's when birds are feeding their young. And if you go through and spray all the insects at that time, there's not as much food for the birds that they should be taking back to their nests. So yeah, it's a real problem in general. But yeah, native plants help with that. If you have native plants that don't have. Oh, really? So in the chat, there's like a thing. I was just hearing about botulism hitting birds in Tulare Lake. I hadn't heard that actually, and I'd actually be really surprised about that, because the thing that usually causes botulism outbreaks in birds is that there's not enough water to dilute the poop, and it kind of tends to, you get that anaerobic bacteria happening, and it but in a big system like that, I'm actually surprised that they're having botulism issues. They're okay. It says a big problem appears at college. Yeah, I don't know. They're saying they're worried about that. Oh shoot, San Francisco Chronicle, of course, paywalling it on me. But I hadn't heard that being a problem yet. But hmm. But that does tend to happen when it's warm. So as it cools down, it's usually better. Unfortunately, as the climate changes again, as it warms up, we're having fewer cold for freezing days in the winter. That tends to be a problem for longer. But the good thing is, if there is a lot of habitat for them to spread out into, it's usually less of an issue. So it looks like a mallard and a white-faced ibis. Hmm. Yeah, the bigger problem this year is that they are still having a big avian flu breakout that's happening. Avian influenza. So that's been mostly associated with captive birds, but also it tends to happen in the bigger things like ducks and geese, because they hang out in big flocks. So, but yeah, I was, I don't know if you guys have heard, there's this podcast called Jumpstart Nature that's really good. But they were talking about how the best way to help birds is to plant your bird feeder instead of putting up feeders. So planting native plants to provide food that way is a better way to do it, because it doesn't concentrate the birds in one small place like at feeders. So that is one of the dangers of having feeders and birds relying on feeders instead of natural food, is that they do get concentrated in one place, and it's easier to spread disease that way. So I definitely encourage people, if you want to see more birds in your yard, it's a great way to do it, but by planting the plants that attract them. So again, things like if you want berry eating birds, plant toyon, plant coffee berry, plant an elderberry if you have room. So that tends to draw a lot of birds. If you want seed eaters, things like sunflowers, fantastic for goldfinches and house finches. Some of the sparrows as well. So let's see. Is there any other like really special? The real special ones like Oh, here we go. Someone in the question and answer said, Colleen said, every spring I see Bullock's Oriole in my yard for about 3 to 5 days, and then I've never seen them feed. What would they be feeding on? Bullock's Orioles are frugivores, so they do eat a lot of fruit, but they feed their young, and they eat a lot of insects as well. The ones that we see coming through the valley here typically don't stay to nest. They mostly go up to higher elevations in the foothills. So I see them a lot up in the oak woodlands. That's their main habitat. So there is usually a few pairs that hang out along the river. So at Soilborn Farm, there's some tall sweet gum trees along the kind of the east side of the property, and there was a pair of Bullock's Orioles that stayed there through the summer. So they do occasionally hang out, but they really need a lot of trees to have places to find enough caterpillars to feed their young. So if there's not caterpillars around, they don't stick around. So So it depends on what you have in your yard, but they do pass through here in the spring. So a lot of them are on their way to going farther north or going up to higher elevation is probably what's happening when they come through. If you have a hummingbird feeder, sometimes they'll come into those, but I tend to see in our area, I tend to see hooded orioles use hummingbird feeders more than I see a Bullock's oriole doing it. For some reason, the hoodeds are really, they're more, I feel like they're more nectar feeders. So I see them doing a lot more drinking at flowers in general than I see Bullock's. Bullock's, I see eating more fruit, things like elderberry and stuff like that. But they're mostly gone by the, they eat the early fall fruit. But in the Central Valley, the Bullock's orioles pass through really early. Most of them are gone by the end of August. Yeah, so you kind of get to know as you spend more time birding and being out in the field. You tend to get used to their timing, things like that. So you know what to look for and what time of year to look for it. So. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? It's really great to answer a lot of. I really enjoyed the questions. They're a lot of fun. Plus, I didn't have too much time to prepare a lot of talk. I think of what other.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Actually, you've raised some really interesting um, you know, I had not fully appreciated the aerial spraying, for example, that you mentioned, and the impact that that has on the insect population. I mean, vector control is not going anywhere anytime soon.
Nope.
So, you know, I'm curious, what how do what's the answer for something like this? Is it being organic in your native garden? Is it um, because certainly those pesticides, especially when they're aerial dispersed, that can drift is real,
Yeah, it gets
and that can
everywhere.
move long ways. So
Yeah.
that's a profound effect on the insect population.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, that's not going anywhere. I mean, the biggest thing you can do, I mean, the way they spray tends to hit certain things more than others. So it does tend to hit caterpillars a little less than I think than the aerial flying insects. So things like obviously mosquitoes is what they're aiming for, but they do get quite a few other things. But um, the thing about poison things, pesticides and things like that is that it's not going to get everyone, but the fewer insects there are, the fewer even fewer they will be after they spray. So if you have a lot of insects and they spray and they get some, still means there's enough food left over. So I mean, I think the thing still stands for us is the more native plants that you can have that feed insects, the more insects you're going to have, even if there is things like vector control spraying for mosquitoes. You know, so it's not a all hope is lost kind of thing. It's more of yeah, it's a problem, and it should be something you're concerned about. But the only way you can combat it is give those insects cover and a place to feed and grow, and then I always tell people, especially in the California native plant group, I tend to find that there's some people that are in those groups and they're gardening with natives, but they're not thinking. I always say to think about it the right way is that if insects aren't eating your plants, your garden's not doing what it should be doing. If you're gardening for with natives, the whole point of gardening with natives is if you don't, the whole point is insects, and the whole point is that they should eat your yard up a little bit. Doug Talley talks about how an oak tree, like if you have a problem with insects when you're looking at it, the leaves are being eaten, just take 10 steps back and the problem goes away because you don't notice it when it's but I always tell people like, oh, if they have insects, I'm like, oh, that's awesome, your garden's super successful, you're feeding caterpillars that then are going to feed frogs and lizards and birds and pretty much everything else. So I think it's about rewiring how we're thinking about gardening. If we're planning for natives, that's what you want is you want the insects to show up. And yeah, they're gonna, your red bud may get completely stripped of all its leaves, but those leaves will grow back in like a couple weeks. It's really funny. I've seen whole trees get defoliated by like red humped caterpillars, And if it's early in the season, the tree will grow new leaves and it'll be fine. It's not gonna permanently harm the plant. Especially if it's already established. Obviously, if it's brand new, maybe you pick them off for the first couple seasons or something, give it a chance. But most of the time, caterpillars aren't stripping the trees bare and killing them. They're eating what they need to to feed off of, and then the birds show up and start eating them. So it's I always think about it as rewire your thinking about what a pest is. A pest is something that bothers us, but a pest is food for something else. So
it's an amazing protein source. I see that there's one more question that
oh
popped up in the Q&A, and that's
yes
common sunflowers. Can you
yeah
comment on sunflowers in a horticultural sense, and
I
also
love
in the native?
yeah I love well yeah so there are several. Actually, California has several native species of sunflower. The one that you see along the freeway that's really widespread, the Helianthus annuus, is the one people call common sunflower. That is a native, and it's a widespread native. It's not just native to California, it's native to pretty much to most of North America that has open space, because it thrives kind of in disturbed areas. And so that's really hey, stop. My dog's begging for pets over here. But yeah, that and lots of things do eat that. There are quite a few caterpillars that eat it. I actually see birds eating it directly. Things like lesser goldfinches and house finches will often eat the leaves themselves. I see them actually like taking chunks of the leaves. And then the seeds are a great resource in the winter. You leave the seed heads on, and you'll have the goldfinches like hanging from them and picking out the individual seeds to take off with them. So yeah, there's sunflowers are fantastic. They're really pretty much a lot of the Asteraceae have really good seed crops for birds. Things like common California aster. That's another good one for goldfinches. I did talk about the Amsynchia. That's a really popular one for Lawrence's goldfinches, but there are other birds that eat that as well. The little especially they seem to like the underripe ovules that are just they're still soft, and they just love picking through there and eating those. So yeah.
Well, in my experience as a gardener, I've noticed that planting sunflowers around your tomatoes is an excellent way to control tomato hornworms. So,
Oh,
a couple of very small modifications in incorporating native plants near your vegetable garden is a great way to go about integrated pest management. I've found, we
well,
don't do any spraying here on our property, so.
yeah, and late season fruit. If you are harvesting fruit that kind of ripens a little bit later in the summertime, having elderberry around to distract the birds away from whatever you're growing tends to help out. They do tend to they tend to choose the native more. And actually, if you want to, we can actually eat elderberry too. I mean, elderberry makes great syrup and jam and things like that. So, usually those plants, if you got a nice big strong elderberry, there's plenty for the birds and for people. So.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any more questions. I really appreciate you sharing your amazing photographs with us and your experience on birding in the Central Valley. I know that the next time that I walk through the oak woodlands near my home and where I frequently walk, I'm going to be looking at things a little bit differently. And I thank you for that, Cliff.
Thanks. And if you did want to, I do lead bird walks for the Sacramento Audubon Society occasionally, and also a couple times monthly, usually at Soilborn Farms in Rancho Cordova. So if you want to get out in the field with me, definitely welcome. I see a couple. I saw a question. Someone asked, did you ever go for the vermilion flycatcher at Maxwell Cemetery? Yes, I actually saw that bird a couple different years. And actually, it's kind of become an interesting thing is that there are several places now where vermilion flycatchers are showing up in the valley more regularly, especially down in the Merced County area. There's been up to like 7 wintering. So there's some sort of dispersal mechanism. So birds tend to, at certain times of year, have like regular dispersal, and like there always was a few birds that would show up in the north. Like the one that showed up in my yard as a kid up in Lincoln. But it was a lot more uncommon, but it's become more common in recent years, especially into the San Joaquin Valley. So places like Merced and Stanislaus. have a few wintering vermilions almost every year now. So thanks, Greg. Oh, and
Do
I
you happen
see.
to have a hypothesis as to why those vermilions are showing up more
Well, I mean,
often?
it could be that the warming climate makes it more hospitable for them to stay in the winter up this way, and so they can get back to their breeding areas faster. So a lot of times, it tends to be male birds, and that tends to be, males tend to do a thing, if it's successful and the bird survives doing it, it's young, it'll pass on its genes, and then its young tend to be disposed to. There's some element of migration that's hereditary, and so these could be the offspring of males that came up to the valley and survived and did really well when they went back to their native territory, and so their offspring are also migrating a similar path as them. So, but we just don't. I don't think we know for sure. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that takes a lot of time and a lot of study to actually say for sure. So I wouldn't say that for sure, but that would be my hypothesis on that, I think. So yeah.
That's fantastic. All science starts with observations. So
Yep.
I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Cool. Well, thanks for
Okay.
coming, everybody. It
Thank you
was great.
again.
Oh, one more Q&A question. Oh, Greg said thanks. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, thanks for